Hello, world, and we are back. My name is Kyle Fischl. This will be episode 198 of my poker vlog. For this one, I play a 2-5 session at Sarasota, Florida, the One-Eyed Jacks Poker Club. On this one, I have a ton of interesting hands to go over, so we're going to get right into them. First hand of note. I'm on the gun spot with ace-queen offsuit. I raised to $20. The +1 cutoff button and big blind calls, so we end up going 5 ways to a flop, which comes queen 4 clubs. Well, there's a flush draw to get value from, worse, all middling pocket pairs, tons of stuff. We're going to size to about 50% pot. The button is the only caller, so player with position on us. We are heads up to a turn card, which I'm praying is a safe one. So, of course, it is the jack of clubs. Completing queen jack, completing the club draws. A lot of stuff gets there. So with my exact holding without a club, I check it to my opponent, pretty standard, and he bets $75. Absolute hate to see this bet, hate to see this sizing, but for this price, I can't fold top pair, top kicker. Hopefully he just has like queen 10 with a club, maybe jack 10 with a club, king queen, pocket 8s with a club. There's some stuff I still beat, so for $75, I make the call. The river is the 6 of hearts. Completing 3-5, but I don't think that's too relevant here. When I check to my opponent, they check it back and show queen jack offsuit. So it was definitely bad turn card. In the moment, I really thought 2-pair was more likely than a flush, and turns out I was right, and we start out this day losing a decent sized pot. Next interesting spot, I have ace 10 of spades from the small blind with a button straddle. I raised to $35. The big blind and the button calls, so we end up going 3 ways to a flop, which comes king, queen, queen with 1 spade. I'm not going to c-bet this one specifically. I think if either of these opponents has a king or queen, they're never folding. So bluffing here seems to be bad. If I get check raised, I'm blowing off my gut shot, which should be good some of the time. And my backdoor spade should be good some of the time. But when I check, both other players check through. Alright, when this happens, it seems to me no one can be too strong. So when the turn is actually the king of clubs, I decided to bet $55. I think if I had ace king or any king, I would check the flop some of the time. I do have top pairs that are checkbacks. So thinking my opponents can't really have a strong hand here, $55 will be the bet. Unfortunately for me, the player to my direct left, the big blind, decides to make the call. And then we end up going heads up to a river card, which is the deuce of spades. This was definitely a one and done for me. I'm not going to try to bluff into what I think is a full house here. So when I check, my opponent bets $100. It's a quick fold from me. Kind of unfortunate. I guess my opponent checked back with a top pair as well, so when they turn a full house, they're never folding. After that, with a button straddle, the small blind and big blind decide to call. I make it $50 with ace queen offsuit from the cutoff. I think it's pretty standard. Hopefully this time it goes good for me. On this one, the button is the only caller. The other two players fold, so we're heads up to a flop, which comes queen 10 deuce with 2 hearts. Well, we flop top pair with ace queen a second time. Hopefully this time it works out a little bit better. This time I bet $40. Don't need to go full half pot, as it's heads up and I don't need to protect against 4 other opponents. And for $40 seems to be enough. My opponent folds and we take down the first hand of the night, finally booking a win. Looks like things are turning around for me. Well, I must be desperate because from the under the gun spot, I decided to raise queen deuce of diamonds to $15. The middle position button and big blind decide to call, so we end up going 4 ways to a flop, which comes 10, 5, 3 with 1 diamond. I have an overcard, some backdoors, but this is not really going to be a board. I'm going to c-bet into 3 other players. But when I check, the middle position player bets $50, and then it folds back to me. I think this is a fun kind of float spot. There's plenty of backdoors that I can turn my hand into a bluff on. Additionally, if my opponent has like 10-9, any card that's higher than a 10 is going to be considered a bluff out. If they hit, I'm going to pile money in there and hope to get a pair of 10s to fold. So this is kind of a floaty player-specific exploit that I'm doing here. When I call the $40, the turn is the 7 of diamonds. Not higher than a 10, but gives us one of our backdoors we were looking for. The plan is still to check raise here and put a lot of pressure on single 10s. This time we'll be semi-bluffing instead of just regular bluffing if like a king hit. But when I check to my opponent, they check back. And our semi-bluff would have worked kind of because we river the jack of diamonds. So we actually get runner, backdoor diamond. Can't afford this to check through, but when my opponent checks back the turn, I don't think they're ever too strong here. So this isn't really like a pot or over pot size bet spot, I think. I'm trying to get called by a single pair that's not even top pair. So I decided on a sizing of $75. And after a medium-sized tank, my opponent eventually flicks it in, and queen deuce is good. The upswing is continuing. Alright, time for a real hand, not that queen deuce stuff. I have ace king. And when I button straddle, there are 4 callers before the button makes it 40. This is the best squeeze spot you're probably ever going to get. A near premium on the button with a ton of dead money in here. So we're definitely bumping this one up. I make it $135 and only the original raiser decides to call. So I'm going heads up to a flop, which is 944 rainbow. There is no connectivity for me specifically, but I do think that I have a range advantage on this board. Should have priced out any 4s that my opponent may have. And let's see, he has exactly pocket 9s. I have all the overpairs, 10s plus, specifically queens, kings, and aces, and those ones my opponents really should not have all too often. And continue to apply pressure on this board specifically should put a lot of my opponents' raise calling hands into the blender. Like ace jack, I'm beating and feels bad to just fold. King queen, queen x suited. Maybe the smallest pocket pairs of like 6s, 7s, 8s feel terrible facing another bet. So I start out with a $100 C bet. It is a down bet. I'm planning on piling in on almost any turn card if my opponent decides to call, but he folds pretty quickly, so we win a 3-bet pot without making a hand. Next hand of note. I think I've been too aggressive lately, so with pocket 2s, I decide to limp. There's one other limp before. The cutoff makes it $15. The button middle position call, then I'm obviously calling. We end up going 4 ways to a flop, which comes ace, 9, deuce, rainbow. I decide to lead out small here. My thought process being, if any of my opponents had a strong ace, they might raise here and we could start building a pot. If my opponents had like a weak ace, they might just check this back and get to see free turns and rivers. So we're going to lead for 15 with almost assuredly the best hand. One player decides to call. All right, it's not a raise. But a second player decides to call. Alright, well 3 ways to a turn card is decent. We're still building the pot. And then the turn card is the 7 of spades. So a complete brick. Nothing should really be giving an ace any kind of worry. So we're going to continue betting. We bet $35. Would love for this to go 3 ways a second time. But the first player folds and then the cutoff decides to call. So we are heads up to a river card, which is the 4 of diamonds. So a complete brick. Hopefully my opponent has ace jack, ace 10, ace 9. Any of that stuff that's going to pay off a large bet. I think it's time to size up. If I had any kind of bluffs, I'd be betting big here, trying to get an ace specifically to fold. So we're going to bet $125. Putting my opponent to the test. Maybe this weird line makes him think that I have like 9-10 or 9-8. 2-5 players make tons of mistakes all the time, so hopefully he just makes a mistake and pays off a bet here with a weak hand. After a decent long tank, he settles on a fold. Cannot get paid here, but it's always nice and profitable to flop a set. On the next hand of note, I have ace jack of hearts in early position. I raise to $20. As usual with this particular video, we get 4 callers, so we end up going 5 ways to a flop, which comes 8-6 deuce with 2 hearts. Flopping a flush draw seems great. However, the small blind decides to lead for $40. I think this opponent's trying to name his own price with 9-7, 7-5, 2 hearts, and 8x. And we're not going to let that happen. 2 overs and a flush draw. We have a ton of equity, and we're probably going to have the best hand by the river, even versus like a pair of 8s. So I decided to raise right now to $125. Additionally, when called, if the turn is like a queen of diamonds, I can just check back and see a free river card, kind of name my own price, keep the betting lead, put these leaders back in their place. And for $125, it folds back to the player who led for 40, and he makes the call. And we bink our flush immediately with the king of hearts, and my opponent checks to me. Being as it's an overcard and a heart, I think I'm going to size down here. If I was just bluffing with like ace king, I would try to go for some thin value bet against an 8, maybe pocket 9s. All kinds of stuff. So for $75 is going to be the turn bet. Trying to get more money in there. But for $75, my opponent just folds.
What the fuck did I do wrong? Tell me.
Maybe he just reads me like a book. Maybe this looks face up as I've just made a flush and trying to get paid. But either way, he called 125 on the flop and could not call anything on the turn. Still a profitable hand. On the next hand of note, I have ace queen offsuit in the big blind. The under the gun player raises to $20. There are 2 players who call before the button makes it $75. Now the button has about 300, 350 in his stack, so I think it's fine to get it in against him, especially when I have ace queen specifically. I think he has a lot of weaker hands that are trying to steal this dead money. The button range should be wider than anyone else's, so maybe even has like an ace 5 in there sometimes. pocket eights, all kinds of weak stuff. Pocket eights considered weak because it can be counterfeited a lot more often than like jacks would. So ace queen offsuit's gonna be a 4-bet for me. We make it $300. Get all this 3 players that put in 20 out of there, so we get an extra 60 in there before the button goes all in. For about 300, we're definitely in there. He asked me if I want to run it once or twice. I'm always a 2 times kind of guy, and on the first flop we see a queen. I announce that I have a queen. He doesn't say anything. Turn 8, river king. Well, that's unfortunately. I lose to ace king still. Second board, king high as well. That means I'm dead against ace king on both boards. Turn jack, my opponent announces he has a set, so I guess we're going to chop. But the river's a 10! Oh, he shows pocket jacks, and we have a pair of queens on top and a straight on bottom. And we end up scooping this one on a really gross river card. At least on this day, the $300 4-bet with ace queen works out for me. Very thankful for that one. Following that, I look down at king 5 of hearts for middle position. With a button straddle, there are 3 callers. I see some dead money out there, so I'm going to attack it. I make it $65. The button decides to call, which I'm not happy about. I think everyone else is going to call at that point, but the 3 limpers decide to fold, so we end up going heads up to a flop, which comes queen 10-3 with 2 hearts. So we play a trash hand, but get an over and a flush draw. Seems pretty good. I start out with a $45 bet. Think even to this sizing, like pocket 9s and the weakest 10s are just going to fold. But for $45, my opponent makes the call. All right, hoping to make a straight draw, make my flush, hit a king. Turn is the 3 of spades. Well, not great for me, but I think this is a board where I'm going to continue betting on. My opponent should never really have a 3 here. I'm technically ahead of like jack 9. King jack is beating me, but not having a complete hand yet, as well as some of the queen x and 10x might fold to a down bet / big bet on the turn. So I bet $150, and then my opponent goes all in. Well, that's weird. I don't really know what hand would do this with, except like jack 9 of spades. It's such an overbet that it couldn't really be for value. I mean, you could raise ace 3 to 400, 500 maybe. Think all in's a bit too much because I could still have pocket queens, pocket 10s. Maybe ace jack of spades feels kind of good with this turn card. I don't know. It's kind of gross. I don't really know what to put this player on, so just having king high, not really thinking my flush is going to hit, thinking my opponent has a made hand at this point. I decide to let my hand go, and my opponent shows ace queen. I mean, I guess that hand is good, but when you jam and I snap, it's stone dead versus a set, 2 pair, a 3. So not my favorite play I've ever seen, but it gets the job done. Gets a draw to fold on a draw heavy board. So max protect's going to work on this one. I win a small one with pocket kings before I finally get to move to a vlogger optimal seat. And on the button, I look down at ace queen of clubs and I button straddle. The under the gun player limps. The +1 raises to 35. 35 is not going to be enough, sir. I make it $100 with ace queen of clubs. The +1 player makes the call. So we end up going heads up to a flop, which comes king queen 5 with 2 hearts with 1 club. Well, second pair, top kicker. When my opponent checks to me, I think this is a fine check back spot. We have a marginally made hand with plenty of backdoor equity that we'd hate to get blown off with a check raise. So when we check it back, the turn is the 7 of clubs. We turn some backdoor equity, and now my opponent bets $200. Very big. Maybe this opponent's going for max protect with a king. Maybe he has a draw like jack 10, maybe a club, maybe a heart draw. Either way, with second pair and the nut flush draw, we're never folding here. So when I make the call, the river is the deuce of hearts. Wrong flush completes, and my opponent bets $225. Does this mean he's afraid of this river card? I mean, he potted the turn and then bets like 1/4 pot on the river. I don't really think a king can bet river here, but I do think hands like jack 10, jack x of clubs, hands with absolutely 0 showdown value will try to go for this river bluff here, but not quite understand what sizing makes sense. I don't really think single pairs can go for value here. I don't think many players do a pot size bet with a draw as well, so this hand making very little sense to me and getting an amazing price. I decided to make the call.
Yeah, you did. I told you not to, but you went anyway.
And my opponent has 7-3 of hearts, I would say, which is not a very standard under the gun open. Not really a 3-bet calling candidate. But, you know, it gets rewarded anyway, so nice hand to that guy. I get a little bit back, winning 2 medium-sized pots before I look down at pocket jacks on the button. My nemesis in the +1 raises to $20. The cutoff calls. We're 3-betting this one to $80. Pocket jacks in position on the button. Let's play a bigger pot. My nemesis is 1 caller, and then the cutoff calls as well. We end up flopping an overpair on 10-8-5 with 2 clubs. We do have the jack of clubs, which is somewhat relevant, blocking some flush draws. But on this flop, my nemesis leads out for $150. I don't think there's much analysis here. I have an overpair. We beat ace 10, jack 9, 9-7, 6-7, random club draws. Too many things to fold, so we call the 150. Think raising will be an overplay. The turn is the 6 of clubs. Kind of devastating as the club draws get there, 9-7 gets there. A lot of stuff actually gets there. And my opponent continues for $300. I suppose looking back at this, I probably should have folded here.
Should have listened to me, Quaid. I was there to keep you out of trouble.
I mean, my opponent did show that he will bet with semi-bluffs. Not everyone in the poker field has that ability, but when you find someone who does and a card that completes everything hits, you should probably just fold. But I have the jack of clubs to fall back on. I still have an overpair. If the board pairs, I beat hands like 8-7, 8-5, some things like that. So we're going to call this one. Maybe a little bit of revenge mode has been activated, which is not a very good profitable strategy in poker. When I call, the river is the 6 of diamonds, so we do counterfeit a lot of 2 pairs, having an overpair, beating ace 10. My opponent bets $400. And basically, I just don't think my opponent could have it on me twice. You're going to have to show me, sir. And I make the call.
Harry, you're making a big mistake.
And he has pocket 5s. So just leads out with a set. Bets again when every draw hits. Doesn't worry about it because he's going to fill up on the river and get a pair of jacks to pay him off. Single pair into a full house is not going to be a good winning strategy. We lose a monster pot, probably the biggest one of my night, to the same player who crushed me a few hands ago. But that's okay. We have pocket 8s on the button. When the cutoff makes it 25, I decided to just call this one. 3-betting's not been working out for me recently, so gonna play one a little bit more chill. 2 other players that limped called, so we end up going 4 ways to a flop, which is ace 8-7 with 2 spades. So now it's our turn to flop an 8. When it checks to the cutoff, who was the guy who made it 25, he bets 75. Doesn't have a whole lot left in his stack. I think just calling is best. Want all of his random aces to keep firing and not give up. So we make the call, even if one of these other players come along. We're not too worried about our hand at this point. When they both fold, the turn is the 6 of hearts, completing 9-10, but hopefully he doesn't have that one. When I check, my opponent goes all in for about $300. So it looks like we're going to get a little rebate on this one. We have a set. How could we possibly lose this one? When I put it in, he asked if we want to run it once or twice. I run it twice. Show the pocket 8s, but my opponent has ace queen. He is drawing dead, and we get a little bit back. Definitely needed that one. And a final hand of note. I'm in the cutoff with pocket queens with 2 limps. I raise to $30. Only one of the limpers calls, so we end up going heads up to a flop, which comes 9-5-4 with 2 hearts. Gonna bet relatively small here. We have an overpair, but me and others seem to keep flopping sets today. When I bet $40, my opponent makes the call, and the turn is the 3 of clubs. Again, some straights get there. Can't get any clean runouts, it seems, today, but we're not going to stop betting. Think a 9 will pay off a large bet. If my opponent has heart draw, we want to protect against that, so I bet $110. My opponent, who has a very creative style of building his chip stack, eventually gathers $110 and flicks it in one at a time. And the river is the king of spades. Losing to king x of hearts feels gross. My opponent checks to me. I don't see how I could ever get 3 streets out of this board with my exact hand, so I decide to check it back. And queens are good. My opponent shows ace 4. Okay, I guess we'll take the $110 turn gift. That's what it definitely is. Unfortunately, all these medium hands were taken out by the big jacks into 5s and ace queen into a flush. So we're actually down $900 on the day, played for 4 hours, which equates to $225 an hour, or 45 big blinds an hour. Unfortunately for me, the session-defining hand was definitely jacks into a set of 5s. I do think you should not be making a habit of folding over pairs, but on dicey boards when your opponent is basically screaming a lot of strength, I suppose listening to them and folding from time to time is not the worst result. You know, winning a ton of medium and small hands is going to be wiped out by the 1 or 2 massive ones that go the other way, so definitely need to work on avoiding the giant landmines and Hopefully, if we can just avoid the big blunders in the future, we will get back to the profitability train. Today was not that day, but if you've made all of this point, I appreciate it. Please consider hitting a like button on the video. Helps me out a bunch, and I would appreciate it. And I will see you on the next one.